The night before Christmas, my late wife appeared in my dream and grabbed my collar, her voice trembling with urgency. "Don't wear the coat our son gave you. It's not a gift." I woke up gasping, drenched in sweat. The mink coat was still hanging in my closet, perfect, expensive, meant to keep me warm for Christmas. I picked it up and ran my hand over it. I noticed something unusual. At that exact moment, the blood in my veins seemed to freeze. Hello everyone, welcome to this story. Before we continue, comment where you're watching from and tell me if you would trust a warning from a dream like that. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Note: this is a fictional story enhanced for experience and meaningful insight. Similarities are purely coincidental only. The air in my lungs turned to shards of ice as I clawed my way back from the suffocating dark, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Thane Garrison, a 62-year-old retired bridge inspector with a gaze as steady as the steel beams I once surveyed, jolted awake in my Beacon Hill townhouse. I was gasping, the metallic smell of old radiators filling the room. But the scent was secondary to the phantom pressure on my shoulders. In the dream, Savannah had been so real that I could see the fine lines around her eyes, those beautiful, tired eyes that had closed for the last time 2 years ago. She wasn't a wispy ghost or a gentle memory. She was a frantic force of nature, her fingers digging into my marrow with a strength she never possessed in life. Thane, she had rasped, her voice sounding like dry leaves skittering over a gravestone. "Listen to me now, you don't have much time." I tried to reach for her to tell her how much the house had emptied since she left, but her warning cut through my grief like a cold blade. "Don't wear the coat," she commanded, her face inches from mine, "and for the love of God, don't drink the coffee." The specificity of it was a physical blow, a dual-threat warning that suggested a coordinated multi-step plan for my demise. Silence. Absolute heavy silence, except for the frost cracking against the window pane like a bone snapping. I sat up, my silk pajamas clinging to the icy touch of sweat on my neck. The red glow of the digital clock informed me it was exactly 3:47 a.m. on Christmas Eve. I rubbed my face, trying to force the gears of my mind back into their logical grooves. I was a man of bridges of stress tests and load-bearing calculations. I didn't believe in spectral visitors or premonitions. "It was just a dream, Thane," I whispered, to the empty, shadowed corners of the master bedroom. Just the anniversary of the funeral, playing tricks on a lonely brain. But as the adrenaline began to recede, a specific memory surfaced, one that didn't belong to the past. 2 weeks ago, my son Reed had stopped by with a heavy mahogany-colored gift box. He'd insisted I save it for Christmas morning, a special luxury to brighten my spirits. How could a dead woman know about a gift that hadn't even been purchased? When she drew her last breath, I swung my legs out of bed, the floorboards groaning under my weight. My joints were stiff, a reminder of the decades spent climbing ladders and inspecting rusted rivets. But my mind was suddenly terrifyingly sharp. I walked toward the walk-in closet, my gaze fixed on the dark wood of the door. My hand trembled as I reached for the handle, my breathing shallow. I didn't want to be a paranoid old man, yet the vividness of Savannah's touch refused to fade. I opened the door, and the moonlight through the high window caught the shimmering gold ribbon of the gift box resting on the top shelf. I froze, my blood turning to slush. The lid was slightly ajar, just a fraction of an inch, revealing a glimpse of the dark fur within. I knew I had left it perfectly sealed when Reed delivered it. Someone had been in this room checking the trap while I slept. My eyes locked onto the dark mahogany closet door, where the gold ribbon on Reed's gift box shimmered like a coiled snake in the moonlight. Grief usually dulls the senses, but tonight, the memory of my wife's instincts felt sharper than a razor pressed against my throat. I sat on the edge of the bed, the blue tint of pre-dawn light beginning to bleed through the frost on the windows, illuminating the dormant dust settled in the crevices of the radiator. My hand brushed my shoulder, still feeling the ghostly weight of Savannah's touch. I remembered her last warning before she died, a moment I had tucked away as the rambling of a fevered mind. She hadn't talked about her own pain or the fear of the dark. She had gripped my wrist and whispered a vague, urgent command to watch the shadows around Reed. At the time, I'd ignored it, chalking it up to a mother's eternal, irrational fretfulness. Now, staring at that mahogany box in the closet, the memory felt like a blueprint for a disaster I was already standing in the middle of. Savannah had always possessed a brand of uncanny foresight that was more mathematical than mystical. She was the one who saved our construction business decades ago by spotting the subtle rot in our partner's eyes long before it ever showed up in the ledger. Thane, look at his eyes, not his ledger, she had told me then. There's rot there. She was the structural engineer of our family's safety, the one who could hear a bridge groan before the first crack ever appeared in the concrete. My memories were a deck of cards being shuffled by a ghost, every face-up card revealing a warning I'd been too blind to read until the stakes were my own survival. I traced the timeline of the last 2 weeks, specifically the Sunday afternoon, when Reed and his wife Kezia had arrived unannounced. I recalled the strange, almost hungry look in Kezia's eyes as she watched me run my fingers over the dark fur in the box, and how Reed's laughter had sounded brittle, like glass breaking under the weight of a secret. It's a masterpiece, Dad. Reed had insisted, his voice a pitch too high. Only the best for the man who built everything. I realized then that my son had been looking at me not as a father, but as a problem that required a very expensive, very soft solution. The air in the room felt heavy, the metallic smell of old pipes suddenly oppressive. I stood up, my joints protesting with a stiffness that usually vanished after the first cup of coffee. Coffee. Savannah's dream voice rasped in my ear again, a desperate plea to avoid the morning brew. I moved toward the door, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Click. The sound of the deadbolt was a gunshot in the morning silence. It was 6:30 a.m., far too early for visitors, and far too precise for a mistake. I felt a cold shiver race down my spine as the metallic click of a key turning echoed up the stairwell. I realized with a jolt of pure adrenaline that I had never given Reed or Kezia a spare key to the new deadbolt I'd installed just last month. Yet the mechanism was surrendering, the heavy oak door downstairs, swinging open to admit someone who wasn't supposed to have the means to enter. I held my breath as the floorboards in the hallway groaned under a weight that shouldn't have been there before sunrise. I moved like a ghost through my own hallway, my hand hovering over the heavy brass fire poker I'd snatched from the hearth. The adrenaline from the nightmare and the sound of the unauthorized key turning had me wired, my senses screaming. As I reached the kitchen, the sickeningly sweet aroma of burnt cinnamon and holiday spices hit me, swirling up the stairs like a physical weight. I stepped into the room to find Reed Garrison, 42, standing there with the practiced poise of an investment consultant, though his eyes lacked their usual sharp focus as he began pouring the morning coffee. Beside him, Kezia Garrison, 36, moved through the kitchen like a luxury curator, her blonde hair immaculate even at 7 a.m. as she insisted on the perfect Christmas breakfast. Kezia turned toward me, her smile bright and performative. "Oh, Thane, you're awake. Merry Christmas, Dad. We wanted to give you a morning you'd never forget." She gestured to the counter where several of my prescription bottles were lined up. "I found your medication on the counter and already took the liberty of setting out your morning pills," she said, her voice a trill of helpfulness that made my skin crawl. My heart skipped a beat. I knew for a fact I had finished that specific prescription 2 days ago. I stared at the little white tablets she had placed on a saucer, my mouth filling with the bitter taste of copper born from pure fear. Reed laughed, a hollow sound that didn't reach his eyes. "You look like you haven't slept a wink, Dad. Sit down, let us take care of you. We used that old emergency key you gave us years ago." I didn't correct him. I knew I had changed the locks last month and hadn't given out a single spare. Have you ever looked into the eyes of someone you love and realized you were looking at a stranger holding a knife? That was the sensation as Kezia approached me, holding a cold ceramic mug filled with steaming, dark liquid. "It's a special blend, Thane," she said, her predatory focus locked on my face. "Aconite. I mean acorn-infused, very rare. Drink it while it's hot." The slip of her tongue was like a thunderclap in the quiet kitchen. The steam rose from the mug, a beautiful swirling invitation to an early grave. I took the cup, my fingers trembling slightly. I needed to get rid of it without appearing suspicious. Reed stepped forward, dropping a stack of napkins with a clumsy flourish that seemed like a rehearsed distraction. "Careful, Dad, don't let that precious liquid go to waste," he urged. I used the moment of his feigned clumsiness to fake a violent, racking cough. I turned away, stumbling toward the sink as if gasping for air, and tilted the mug. I watched the dark stream vanish into the basin, the heat of the ceramic finally leaving my palm. The performance felt like a load-bearing test on a bridge I knew was about to collapse. As the last of the coffee disappeared, the kitchen sink gurgled a wet, choking sound that seemed to mock the empty mug in my hand. I stared down at the porcelain, noticing a strange, oily, iridescent film clinging to the surface. It didn't look like coffee. It looked like chemical runoff smelling faintly of bitter almonds and rot. I felt Kezia's eyes on my back, cold and assessing. The look she gave the drain told me she knew I hadn't swallowed a drop. But she simply tilted her head, her smile never reaching those calculating eyes. The kitchen sink gurgled one final time as the last traces of the oily coffee vanished into the Boston sewage system, taking with it whatever death Kezia had brewed into my morning cup. I stood there gripping the cold porcelain edge, my knuckles white with the effort of maintaining my composure. Behind me, I could hear Reed and Kezia gathering their coats, their movements accompanied by the false brightness of holiday cheer that now sounded like the rattling of chains. "We'll be back around noon to help you get ready for tonight." Dad Reed called from the foyer, his voice carrying that same brittle quality I'd noticed earlier. "Make sure you rest. You need your strength." The front door closed with a heavy thud that seemed to shake the entire townhouse, and then they were gone. I moved to the front window, my fingers pulling back the heavy curtain, just enough to watch their luxury SUV pull away from the curb, its red taillights disappearing into the falling snow, like drops of blood absorbed by white bandages. The silence that followed their departure was absolute, the kind of quiet that amplifies every creak of old wood and every whisper of wind against frost-covered glass. I stood there for a full minute, counting my own heartbeats, making sure they were truly gone before I allowed myself to move. My phone buzzed in my pocket, the vibration startling me so badly I nearly dropped it. Ilara's name lit up the screen, and for a moment I just stared at it, this lifeline to the one part of my family that hadn't been poisoned by greed. I answered, forcing warmth into my voice that I no longer felt in my chest. "Sweetheart, Merry Christmas." Her voice came through clear and bright, untainted by the darkness that had infected my morning. "Dad, Merry Christmas. We're about 2 hours out. Milo's been asking about Grandpa since we loaded the car. He's so excited he can barely sit still." I closed my eyes, picturing my 6-year-old grandson bouncing in his car seat, his innocence a stark contrast to the calculating cruelty I'd just witnessed in my own kitchen. "Tell him Grandpa can't wait to see him." I managed my throat tight. "Knox wanted me to ask about tonight," Ilara continued. "Is it still coat and tie at the restaurant? What should we wear?" The question hit me like a physical blow. The coat. The beautiful, deadly mink coat hanging in my closet upstairs, waiting to wrap me in a chemical shroud. My fingers tightened around the phone until I heard the case creak. "Just wear what's comfortable?" I said the words coming out more strained than I intended. "It's family. We don't need to be formal. Are you okay, Dad?" Ilara's voice shifted, taking on that clinical nurse's assessment that came from years of reading between the lines of what patients said versus what they meant. "You sound tired." "I'm fine." I lied, the taste of copper filling my mouth. Just missing your mother today. The house feels empty without her. I know, Dad. She paused, and I could hear Milo chattering in the background, his voice a bright counterpoint to the darkness pressing in around me. We'll be there at 4. We love you. I love you too, sweetheart. I hung up and stood in the empty foyer, the phone cold in my hand, staring at the stairs that led up to my bedroom. 4 o'clock. I had 6 hours to find out if my own son was trying to kill me, and if Savannah's ghost had truly reached across the void to save my life. The grandfather clock in the corner began to chime, each strike a countdown to either vindication or madness. The heavy, oppressive silence that followed their departure to run errands left me standing in the center of the kitchen, staring at the empty mug and the shimmering, iridescent film in the sink. I forced myself to remain motionless, listening as the front door clicked shut. For the first time in my life, the silence of my own home felt less like a sanctuary and more like a predator holding its breath. I moved to the front window, peeling back the heavy curtains just enough to watch the red taillights of Reed's luxury SUV bleed into the falling snow as they pulled away from the curb. We will be back in an hour, Dad Reed had promised, with that brittle glass-sharp smile. Don't you dare move from that chair. Rest is the best medicine for that brain fog you have been having. I stood there until the street was empty, the weight of the morning's deception pressing into my chest. My first move was toward the front door. I knelt on the cold hardwood, my eyes searching the polished brass of the deadbolt I had installed just last month. My breath hitched. The metal was scarred with fresh, jagged scratches, the unmistakable signature of a lock that had been tampered with or professionally picked. They hadn't used an old emergency key. They had forced their way into my life while I slept. I was back on the job inspecting a structure that looked solid from the curb, but was rotting from the inside out. And this time I was the one standing on the crumbling bridge. I turned away from the door, my movements becoming methodical and clinical, the same way I used to survey the rusted rivets of the Mystic River Bridge. Every stair tread beneath my feet seemed to groan with a warning as I climbed back toward the master suite. I bypassed the kitchen, where the oily residue of the coffee still gurgled in the drain, my focus narrowing on the upstairs hallway. Why would a son, who could barely afford his own mortgage, buy a $6,000 mink coat for a father who preferred flannel? The question hammered in my head with every step. I reached the threshold of my bedroom, where the air felt thick and unnaturally cold, despite the humming radiators. The memory of Reed presenting that mahogany box played in my mind, his theatrical pride, masking the strange, almost hungry look in Kezia's eyes. Only the best for you, Thane, she had whispered, leaning in close. A coat that will last a lifetime. Now those words felt like a tombstone inscription. I stood before the walk-in closet, my hand hovering over the cold brass handle. I expected the smell of mothballs or cedar, but instead my nostrils were hit by a heavy, cloying scent of dormant lavender. It was Savannah's signature perfume, a fragrance that should have faded into nothing months ago. Here it was localized, clinging to the air around the gift box like a spectral warning. It was as if she were standing right behind me, her hand a ghostly pressure on my shoulder. I gripped the handle of the closet door, my knuckles white and trembling. I am a man of science of steel and load-bearing math, but my intuition was screaming louder than any calculation. Before I could pull the door open, a faint, rhythmic scratching sound came from the other side. It was soft, a dry rustling against the garment bag, as if something inside the silk lining was trying to breathe. I stood paralyzed, the scent of lavender and the sound of the scratching pulling me into a darkness I wasn't sure I could survive. I ripped the closet door open, bracing for a physical attack, but found only the heavy, silent shadow of the mink hanging like a drowned man in the stagnant air. The adrenaline was a hot spike in my veins, but the clinical focus of a bridge inspector began to take over. I reached for the plastic garment bag, my hand trembling, as I sought the source of that rhythmic, dry rustling. It wasn't a living thing. Tucked into the ventilation mesh at the top of the bag was a stiff, dried branch of monkshood, its dark, withered leaves positioned to scrape against the plastic with the slightest air current from the bedroom door. It was a deliberate acoustic lure, a trap for my attention. I unzipped the bag, the metallic rasp echoing in the quiet room, and the smell of bitter almond and wet earth rolled out to meet me. As I pulled the coat from its hanger, the physical reality of the gift shifted. The fur felt unnaturally oily, almost tacky, and as I lifted it, the balance of the garment was completely off. This coat was too heavy. It was twice the weight a mink of this size should be, the shoulders weighted down as if with hidden lead. "It's just a plant," I whispered, trying to steady my breath as bile rose in my throat. Why would they put a plant in here? I carried the luxury item toward the master bedroom window, where the hard, bright sunlight of a snowy Boston morning would act as my forensic lamp. Silence. Then the sun hit the blue silk lining, revealing a map of murder written in bile-colored stains. Under the direct light, my inspector eyes found the structural flaws, faint greenish-brown discolorations seeping through the inner fabric. I ran my fingers over the collar and the cuffs, finding the material damp and sticky. I recognized the pattern of the rot. It wasn't the fur dying or a spill from a careless celebratory drink. Something was being exuded from within the padding itself, a slow-release corruption. Savannah always said the truth hides in the seams, and she had once warned me that green and brown on silk meant poison in the well. This wasn't a stain. It was a delivery system. How many times had I hugged Reed while he wore the face of a son, all while he was sewing my shroud? The thought was a cold blade in my gut. I began to turn the garment over in my hands, looking for the point of entry for whatever toxin was saturating the silk. Inside the inner breast pocket, I found a small, expertly hidden label. It wasn't the name of a high-end tailor or a department store. It was a slip of parchment with a single line of elegant, sharp handwriting in Kezia's script for the heart that stops for us. My hands went cold, and the reflection of the snow outside felt like a funeral shroud. The traditional loyalty I had held for my bloodline was being dismantled by the very evidence I held. I turned the coat inside out, stripping away the illusion of the gift. And that's when I saw the precise, surgical slits along the underside of the collar, a hidden reservoir tucked against where my jugular would be waiting to be emptied. I stood there in the sunlight, a man who had spent his life ensuring bridges didn't collapse, finally acknowledging that the one beneath my own feet had already been cut away. The silver blades of my wife's sewing scissors felt like cold justice in my palm as I positioned them over the first surgical slit in the silk. I worked with the steady, practiced hand of a man who had spent 40 years inspecting the structural integrity of the Commonwealth's bridges. But today the decay I was measuring was far more intimate. I carefully snipped the fine threads of the inner lining, the metallic click of the blades sounding like a clock counting down in the heavy silence of the bedroom. As the fabric parted, a thick brown, oily substance began to weep from the padding, mixed with a fine greenish powder that shimmered with a sickly vitality. The smell hit me immediately, a nauseating wave of sweet rot masked behind a faint chemical hint of honey and sulfur. My stomach churned, and I had to clamp my jaw shut to keep the bile down. This was a specialized dimethyl sulfoxide carrier, an industrial-grade DMSO designed to pull toxins directly through the skin on contact. It was a sophisticated delivery method that no amateur gardener or casual hater would ever know how to employ. "Steady, Thane," I whispered to myself, my voice sounding like a stranger's. "Don't let a single drop touch your skin." I used a small plastic spoon to meticulously collect a sample, my movements clinical and precise. This wasn't just a gift anymore. It was a high-tech assassination tool disguised as a luxury item. They didn't just want me dead. They wanted me to suffer through a natural heart attack, while I sat in my favorite armchair, blissfully unaware that my own clothes were killing me. The oil was a dark, viscous lye bleeding from the seams of a gift that was meant to be my final suit. I transferred the foul mixture into a small Ziploc bag, a habit ingrained from decades of preserving material samples from rusted rivets and crumbling concrete. Once the seal clicked shut, I stood in the center of the room I had shared with Savannah for 35 years, holding a bag of green death. The silence of the house became deafening. Have you ever held proof in your hands that the person you gave life to is the one trying to take yours? I looked at the family photos on the mahogany dresser, my eyes landing on a framed shot of Reed as a toddler, his chubby hands reaching for a ball. How many times did I hug you while you carried this poison in your heart, Reed? Every warm visit over the last 6 months flashed before me, recast as a reconnaissance mission. The concerned questions about my blood pressure and the overly attentive check-ins weren't acts of love. They were data points for an executioner. Savannah, you always saw the cracks before the bridge fell. The dream wasn't a haunting. It was a rescue mission from beyond the grave, a final act of the foresight that had kept our business and our souls afloat for so long. As I prepared to tuck the evidence away, I turned the lining one last time, looking for any other surprises. My blood turned to slush in my veins. Tucked into a second smaller pocket near the hem was a slim square tile with a blinking red light, a digital tracking device. The realization hit me with the force of a tidal wave. Reed and Kezia hadn't just left for a simple errand. They were monitoring my movements in real time. They could see exactly where I was in the house, standing perfectly still in my bedroom, holding the very thing they used to mark me for the grave. I clutched the bag of green death to my chest. But then I saw that blinking red light, and I knew they were watching the signal stop in this room. The phone in my pocket felt like a 100-pound weight as I dialed the only man in Boston who could tell me exactly how long I had to live. I stood paralyzed in the center of the master bedroom, my eyes fixed on the blinking red light of the tracker tucked into the minx silk lining. I knew then that they weren't just watching the house. They were watching the signal stop in this very room. I felt a cold chill wash over me as I looked down at my own feet. I kicked off my leather slippers, and there wedged into the heel padding was another identical tile. They hadn't just used a key or tampered with a box. They had mapped my every footfall. Jasper Vance, a 63-year-old MIT professor with glasses perched precariously on his nose, picked up on the third ring. His voice was a rasp of holiday fatigue until I spoke. Jasper. I whispered, my voice cracking. I think my son is trying to kill me. There was a beat of heavy silence before his academic tone vanished, replaced by the clinical precision of a man who spent his life analyzing structural failures. Thane, listen to me, he said, cutting through my rising panic. Don't touch that bag again. Seal it, leave the tracker on the bed, and drive. Now. I'll meet you at the side entrance of the chemistry lab. It's empty for the break. I did as he said, leaving the trackers in the bedroom to buy myself a window of digital invisibility. I moved with a speed my 62-year-old joints shouldn't have possessed, grabbing my car keys and slipping out the back. Boston was a postcard of Christmas cheer, but I was the ink smudge on the bottom, a dying man driving through a winter wonderland. I gripped the cold steering wheel of my sedan, my knuckles white as I navigated the slushy streets. I passed families in matching wool sweaters and groups of carolers near the common, their red scarves and joyous faces feeling like a grotesque parody of the betrayal sitting in a Ziploc bag on my passenger seat. Every time a black SUV appeared in my rearview mirror, my heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. A siren wailed in the distance. My heart stopped, but it was just an ambulance racing to save someone else. I took a deep, shuddering breath, the smell of old upholstery and fear filling my lungs. Merry Christmas, Thane, I muttered to my reflection in the glass. You're driving to your own autopsy. I crossed the Longfellow Bridge into Cambridge, the Charles River, looking like a sheet of black, unyielding glass under the bruised gray sky. The wind whistled across the water, rattling the frame of my car as I approached the university's sprawling campus. The streets here were desolate, the red Christmas bows on the street lamps fluttering like warning flags in the gale. I pulled into the shadows near the chemistry department, my eyes darting toward the side entrance. Jasper pulled me inside and slammed the heavy steel door, the smell of sterile ozone and old paper hitting me like a physical wall. He didn't offer a greeting, just a grim focus that told me he knew the stakes were as high as I feared. But as the lock clicked into place, I looked through the reinforced glass of the door and felt the blood drain from my face. 2 blocks away, idling near a closed coffee shop, was the familiar glint of Reed's SUV, and through the windshield, I saw the unmistakable reflection of my son's sunglasses watching the building. The fluorescent lights of the lab buzzed with a headache-inducing rhythm as Jasper took the bag of poison from my hands, his touch clinical and cautious. I felt the heavy steel door thud behind us, sealing me into a world of sterile ozone and white tile. I stood by the door for a moment, my heart hammering against my ribs, watching the street through the reinforced glass. Jasper didn't waste time. He moved to a bank of monitors and tapped a few keys, his brow furrowed. Thane, the security cameras already flagged that SUV, he said, without looking up. The system has his plate, and campus security is tracking him through the gates as we speak. If he tries to set foot on this property, he won't get past the first bollard. He ushered me toward a workstation, his movements sharp and purposeful. Jasper placed the Ziploc bag into a fume hood, treating the mink coat residue like weapons-grade uranium. I stood by the stainless steel counters, the cold, vibrating metal biting into my palms as I watched him prep a spectrometer and several glass vials. The silence of the laboratory was heavy, broken only by the rhythmic thumping of the centrifuge and the low, constant whir of the high-capacity ventilation system. I've spent 40 years studying the building blocks of life. Jasper muttered, his voice echoing in the vast, empty room. I never thought I'd be looking for the building blocks of your death. Don't lean over the counter, Thane. We don't know how volatile the vapor is once it hits the solvent. Can a father ever truly look at his son and see a murderer, or do we just see the shadow of the child we once held? As the green laser began to scan the first vial, my mind drifted away from the sterilizers and the smell of high-grade ethanol. I was back in Christmas, 1998. Reed was just a teenager, then his face flushed with the biting New England cold. He had worked every odd job in the neighborhood, saving his meager allowance to buy Savannah a simple glass ornament for the tree. I could still see his pride as he held it out, his eyes shining with a genuine love that was as clear as the crystal in his hand. Dad, look, it matches her eyes, he had beamed. The memory was a physical blow to my chest, a structural failure of my own history. The lab was a cathedral of cold logic, a place where family secrets were reduced to molecular structures and pH levels. Where did that boy go, Savannah? How did we lose him? I looked through the high lab windows, watching the first few flakes of snow beginning to swirl against the gray sky, a stark contrast to the sterile warmth inside. My son was out there sitting in an idling car waiting for my heart to stop. Jasper called me over, his eyes fixed on a monitor that began to sprout jagged, colorful peaks of data. His face was a mask of academic horror. Thane, the concentration here. It's not just meant to kill, he whispered. This is a delayed delivery. It's timed. If you'd worn that coat at the party, the toxin wouldn't have reached your bloodstream in a lethal dose until you were back home, isolated and alone. It was designed to ensure you died in your sleep, far from anyone who could call for help. Jasper's face went from pale to ghostly as the spectrometer beeped with a final shrill notification, and he whispered a name for the substance that made my blood turn to slush. Jasper didn't look at me as he pointed to the monitor, his voice shaking with a rage I hadn't heard in 40 years of friendship. I stared at the blue-white glare of the computer monitor, the jagged peaks of the chemical analysis looking like a mountain range made of ice. It's a masterpiece of malice, Thane, he muttered, his fingers performing a frantic rhythmic tapping against the metal desk. Aconite and hemlock, the devil's cocktail. I watched as he highlighted a specific spike on the graph. He identified a synthetic stabilizer in the mixture, a rare compound he explained was only available to certified botanical research laboratories. It was the digital fingerprint of Kezia's professional life, a link that turned my paternal suspicion into a cold, clinical fact. Jasper explained that the aconite, the queen of poisons, was designed to trigger a cascading heart failure. To any untrained coroner, I would simply look like another 62-year-old man who had pushed his ticker too hard during the holidays. The most terrifying part was the thermal trigger. The mixture was engineered to activate only when warmed by my specific body temperature, ensuring I'd be in the middle of a crowded restaurant, far from any help when it finally took hold. If you had put that coat on, Jasper said, his eyes finally meeting mine, you wouldn't have made it to the second course of your dinner. Cardiac arrest. That was the goal. A silent, festive execution in front of 25 witnesses, with the coat acting as a slow-motion gallows. I felt a cold stone sitting in the pit of my stomach as the technical deliberation of the kill settled in. They hadn't just wanted me dead. They had engineered my ending with the same precision I used to inspect the stress points of a suspension bridge. Jasper moved back to the fume hood to perform a secondary pH test on the swab I'd taken from the morning's coffee mug. The acrid smell of the chemical reagent filled the sterile air as he worked. He confirmed the presence of the same toxins, though at a significantly lower dosage. The coffee was the bait. The coat was the trap, Jasper concluded. The brew was meant to cause dizziness, a bit of brain fog, to make sure I wouldn't struggle when they helped me into the fur later. They were so thorough, Jasper. They didn't just want me dead. They wanted to make sure I couldn't say no. How do you mourn a son who is still breathing, but whose soul has already been replaced by a predator? Absolute disillusionment washed over me, a weight heavier than any steel beam. My own son had sat in my kitchen smiling while he watched me hold a mug of dizzying poison, waiting for the moment he could wrap me in a lethal shroud. Jasper didn't just stand by as a witness. He admitted he had already reached out to an old student of his, a man named Nolan, who specialized in financial crimes. This wasn't just about an inheritance or a simple grudge. Jasper's face was grim as he reached for the secure line on his desk, the electronic lock on the lab door clicking with a heavy final thud. Nolan is on his way, Thane, and he's bringing a file that's going to make this poison look like the kindest thing they did to you. I leaned against the cold metal counter, the humming of the lab equipment feeling like a countdown I could no longer stop. The heavy thud of footsteps echoed in the hallway before the door even opened, heralding a storm that was about to strip away the last of my illusions. I stood rigid beside the stainless steel laboratory bench, my reflection distorted in the polished metal. Jasper turned toward the entrance just as the heavy steel security doors groaned on their hinges. Detective Nolan Prescott, 45, projected the weary but sharp authority of the Financial Crimes Unit as he opened his laptop to reveal the rot hidden in my family tree. He didn't offer a Christmas greeting. The season of peace was clearly not on his agenda. Instead, he moved with a clinical efficiency, stepping past us to secure the perimeter. I watched him check the locks and scan the high, narrow windows for any signs of outside surveillance. The smell of damp wool from his overcoat mixing with the sterile ozone of the lab. I wish we were meeting under better circumstances, Mr. Garrison, he said, his voice as level as a horizon line. But your son has run out of time. My hands tightened on the edge of the counter. Prescott explained that he hadn't just appeared because of Jasper's call. He had been part of a federal task force tracking my son's financial movements for 3 months. To the world, Reed was an investment consultant, a success story in a tailored suit. To the men Prescott tracked, he was a casualty. The entry twist hit me like a physical blow to the chest. The creditors weren't just local thugs. Reed had entangled himself with a sophisticated syndicate that didn't just target debtors, they targeted entire lineages. Kezia's plan to hasten my end wasn't just about greed. It was a desperate maneuver to save her own skin before the syndicate came to collect on the family name. Is there a specific sound for the moment your pride in your child turns into pure, unadulterated fear, I didn't have an answer. Only the sound of my own shallow breathing. 4.7 million. Not a debt. A death sentence written in digital code. Prescott opened his laptop, and the blue light reflected in my eyes, casting ghostly shadows against the white-tiled walls. He turned the screen toward me, displaying a complex web of cryptocurrency transactions and high-interest loans. My son had been caught in a fraudulent pump and dump scheme leveraging organized crime money to chase a win that never came. The detective pointed to a date on the digital ledger highlighted by a red past due stamp. The final repayment deadline had passed exactly 2 weeks ago, the very day Reed had arrived at my house with that mahogany gift box. The loan sharks gave him a choice, his life or yours. Prescott said, the sharp clicking sound of his keys being tapped, punctuating the sentence. And he chose the coat. The crushing weight of that betrayal made the room feel as cold as the December air outside. I stared at the screen until the numbers blurred into a meaningless mess of zeros and ones. But Prescott wasn't done. He scrolled through a subfolder, and my heart stopped. There was a grainy surveillance photo of Reed and Kezia in a dimly lit diner sitting across from a man Prescott identified as a professional cleaner. They weren't panicking in that photo. They were negotiating. This wasn't a last-minute act of desperation. It was a strategy they had been polishing for months while I was still welcoming them into my home. I stared at the screen until the numbers blurred, but Prescott wasn't done. He tapped the keyboard once more. That's the why, Thane. Now let me show you the how and why your daughter Ilara is in just as much danger as you. Prescott pulled up a document that made the room spin, a legal paper with my signature at the bottom that I had never seen in my life yet. It carried the precise weight of my own hand. I leaned closer to the laptop screen, the blue light reflecting off my glasses and stinging my tired eyes. The digitized document was titled Last Will and Testament, and the date at the top was from exactly 1 month ago. As I read through the clinical cold language of the estate distribution, the room seemed to shrink. The document systematically stripped my daughter Ilara of her fair share, redirecting 80% of my $5.5 million estate to Reed. I felt the dry smell of ink from the printer and the sterile lab air fill my lungs, but they offered no clarity. That is my signature, Nolan. I whispered, tracing the curve of the cursive G on the screen. I would know that loop anywhere. But I never signed this. Nolan didn't look away from the monitor. You did sign it, Thane. You just weren't conscious when you did. He explained that the signature wasn't a tracing. It was likely obtained under heavy sedation. I felt a cold sweat break across my forehead as the realization hit me that my life had been liquidated on paper long before the toxins were ever brewed in a lab. Prescott leaned forward, his eyes scanning my face for the moment of recognition he knew was coming. This wasn't just about the will, Thane. This was a systematic campaign spanning 6 months. Let me show you the architecture of your own execution. He pulled up a new screen, this one showing a detailed timeline that made my stomach drop. 3 months ago, he began his finger tapping the first entry. Do you remember a conversation with Reed about your life insurance? I felt the memory surface like a body rising from deep water. It had been a Tuesday afternoon in September. Reed had arrived unannounced, carrying a leather portfolio that looked expensive and official. He'd sat at my kitchen table, the same table where Savannah and I had shared 40 years of morning coffee and spread out documents with the precision of a surgeon laying out his instruments. Dad, at your age, you really need better coverage. He'd said, his green eyes earnest and concerned. Think about Ilara. Think about Milo. What happens to them if something happens to you? The current policy is only $3 million. That's not enough in today's economy. I had trusted him. Of course I had trusted him. He was my son, the boy I'd taught to ride a bike and helped through college. He'd shown me actuarial tables, projected costs, inflation calculations that made my head spin. "I've done all the research," he'd insisted. "You just need to sign here and initial here. You'll be protecting your family." Protected. The word tasted like acid now. 2 months ago, Prescott continued, the gaslighting campaign began. Kezia started planting seeds that you were becoming forgetful, unreliable. I felt another memory crystallize, this one sharper and more painful. Kezia had been visiting more frequently, always with some excuse, bringing soup, checking on the house, offering to help with errands. "Are you feeling okay, Thane?" she'd asked one afternoon, her hand cold on my wrist, as I searched for my reading glasses. "You've seemed a bit scattered lately. Have you talked to your doctor about memory issues?" I'd brushed it off as concern, never realizing she was creating a medical history that didn't exist. "Then your neighbor, Mrs. Patterson," Prescott said, pulling up a text message thread. Kezia sent her multiple messages expressing concern about your cognitive decline. He read aloud, "I'm so worried about Thane. He forgot our dinner plans twice this week, and yesterday he couldn't remember where he parked his car. Reed and I think it might be time to talk about assisted living." I felt the walls of the lab closing in. Mrs. Patterson had mentioned those concerns to me, her face sympathetic and worried. I'd laughed it off, told her I was just distracted by grief. I'd had no idea I was being systematically discredited in my own community. 1 month ago, Prescott continued, his finger moving to the next entry. They made their move on the will. "Do you remember a night when Reed brought over an expensive bottle of wine?" The memory hit me like a freight train. It had been a Bordeaux, a 2015 vintage. Reed had insisted we open it to toast to nothing in particular, to just celebrate being alive. "Just one more glass, Dad," he'd urged, refilling my goblet before I'd even finished the first. "It's a celebration. You deserve the best." I remembered the unusual heaviness that had overtaken me, the way the room had started to blur at the edges. I'd attributed it to grief and exhaustion, never suspecting that my own son had laced my wine with sedatives. I'd woken the next morning on the couch, my neck stiff with a pounding headache and a stack of papers on the hall table. Reed had been there brewing coffee, all helpful efficiency. "Hey, don't worry about those forms, Dad. Just insurance updates. I filed them for you. Those forms were the new will," Prescott said quietly. "You signed away 80% of your estate to Reed while barely conscious. The notary who witnessed it, he's a known associate of the loan sharks your son owes $4.7 million to." 2 weeks ago, Prescott continued, pulling up yet another layer of evidence. They delivered the murder weapon, the coat. I saw security footage from the department store where it was purchased. Kezia spent 40 minutes with a sales associate insisting on specific lining, specific measurements. She took it to a private alteration shop, one that doesn't exist in any business registry. That's where she added the aconite and hemlock. Every month, every week, every day had been a calculated step toward my grave. This wasn't desperation or panic. This was methodical, cold-blooded premeditation, dressed up as family concern. My hands were shaking as I gripped the edge of the lab table. "How long have you known?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "We've been tracking the financial crimes for 3 months," Prescott admitted, "but we didn't have enough for murder charges until you brought us that coat. Thane, they were going to kill you tonight, collect the $5.5 million in insurance tomorrow, and be on a plane to the Caribbean by New Year's. We found the tickets." The centrifuge in the corner slowed to a stop, its dying whine sounding like a dirge. I stared at the timeline on the screen, each entry a nail in the coffin they'd been building for me. 6 months, half a year of my son looking me in the eye. hugging me, telling me he loved me, all while engineering my death with the precision of the bridges I used to inspect. "There's one more thing," Prescott said, and for the first time I heard something like sympathy in his voice. "About your daughter-in-law." Prescott pulled up a series of text messages and emails that proved the rumors of my failing mind had been planted like weeds in a garden, choking out the truth before I even knew I was at war. I leaned back against the cold metal frame of the lab bench, the blue flickering light of the laptop casting dancing shadows across the sterile walls. Nolan tapped a finger against a specific document on the screen, a life insurance policy I had allegedly requested 3 months ago. My blood turned to slush as I saw the figures. The coverage had been bumped from a substantial $3 million to a staggering $5.5 million, with Reed listed as the sole primary beneficiary. I felt the metallic taste of adrenaline in my mouth as a memory resurfaced. Reed sitting at my kitchen table nursing a cup of tea and helping me organize my files. He had looked so earnest when he suggested I update my coverage to protect Alara and the grandkid. In reality, I discovered that the increase was funded by a secret loan Reed had taken out in my own name. I had been unknowingly paying for my own death warrant. I thought he was being a good son, Nolan. I whispered, the heavy winter wind rattling the lab windows like a persistent ghost. He said it was for the family's future. Nolan's eyes remained fixed on the screen, cold and professional. "It was for a future, Thane. Just not yours." He scrolled further, revealing a string of messages Kezia had sent to neighbors and family friends over the last 8 weeks. "How do you fight a lie that everyone you know has already accepted as the truth?" My knuckles turned white as I read her descriptions of my memory lapses, my sudden confusion, and my failing heart. She was meticulously creating a documented trail of my decline. I remembered a neighbor at the grocery store asking if I was feeling okay, a comment I had dismissed as mere polite concern for a widower. They were building a narrative so that when I finally collapsed at the restaurant, no one would call for an autopsy. They would just call it a tragic, expected end to a fading life. "It's the perfect alibi," Mr. Garrison Nolan said, the smell of stale coffee from his thermos drifting between us. "They didn't just plan a murder. They planned the funeral before you were even cold. The ink on the insurance forms wasn't just black. To me, it looked like dried blood. My mind raced through the implications, the sheer scale of the betrayal, making the room feel as though it were spinning. Prescott wasn't finished. He pulled up a final piece of evidence, an airline confirmation, and a resort booking. Kezia had already booked a widow's retreat in the Caribbean for next month, reserved under her maiden name. They were so certain of my demise that they were already planning the celebration. I looked at the screen, my hands finally steady with a cold, hard rage. The vulnerability I had felt moments ago was being replaced by a tactical focus I hadn't felt since my days in the field. "So they've been practicing my eulogy for months." I whispered, the sound of my own voice surprising me with its resilience. "Well, it is time we gave them a different ending. I wasn't just a victim anymore. I was an inspector who had found the rot, and I knew exactly which supports to cut." Prescott closed the laptop with a definitive snap, the sound echoing through the sterile lab like a gavel. "There's one more thing you need to see, Thane. About who your daughter-in-law really is." I felt my pulse jump in my neck, a rhythmic pounding in my temples that made the white walls of the lab seem to pulse. I gripped the edge of the cold, clinical steel lab counter, the metal biting into my palms, as Nolan began to pull up a new set of digital records. This wasn't a financial ledger. It was a deep background file on Kezia Garrison. Nolan revealed that she wasn't born a Garrison, obviously, but she wasn't even the Kezia Morrison she had claimed to be when my son first brought her home. He traced her back to a dust-choked town in Oklahoma, where she grew up as the daughter of a local herbalist and fringe medicine practitioner. The entry twist was a jagged glass shards in my gut. Kezia's mother was currently serving a life sentence in Oregon for a series of insurance-related poisonings. This wasn't just greed, it was the family business. Kezia's college transcript flickered onto the screen, showing a degree in ethnobotany with a specialization in toxic alkaloids. She told us she studied art history at Vassar. I whispered the words, feeling like dry ash. Everything about her was a curated lie. Nolan nodded grimly. She didn't just study art, Thane. She studied the art of making death look like a natural occurrence. The disorientation was a physical weight, making me feel as though I were sinking through the floor. A serial killer. Not in a movie. In my guest room eating my Christmas ham. I had welcomed this woman into the most private corners of my life, trusted her with my son, and she was a predator who had been engineered for this very kill. How many other men were buried under a layer of her luxury curation? The smell of ozone from the photocopier in the corner suddenly felt like the smell of a crime scene. Nolan pulled up a grainy photo from 5 years ago. A man named Arthur Ward found dead at the bottom of a staircase in Oklahoma. He was 58, a widower, who had increased his life insurance weeks before marrying a much younger Kezia. The official cause of death was a cardiac event leading to a fall, but the toxicology back then was never deep enough to find what Jasper found today. "Look at his eyes," Thane Nolan said, pointing to the man's frozen, terrified stare. This wasn't a fall. It was an execution. She's done this before. My son isn't just an accomplice. He's her latest host. I stared at Arthur Ward's face, seeing a mirror of my own vulnerability. The systematic efficiency of the cycle was terrifying. My hand trembled as I reached for the screen, tracing the man's gray, lifeless features. Then I saw it in the footnotes of the Oklahoma autopsy report. It mentioned a faint scent of lavender clinging to the victim's skin. I felt the blood drain from my face as I remembered the cloying scent of my late wife's signature perfume that I had found localized around the gift box in my closet. I looked at Arthur Ward's cold gray face on the screen and then back at my own reflection in the lab window. I wasn't just a father anymore. I was the next entry in her ledger. Detective Prescott leaned forward, the blue light of the laptop casting sharp shadows across his face. "We have 2 hours, Thane. 2 hours to turn the prey into the hunter." I looked at Arthur Ward's cold, gray face on the screen one last time, before the image was minimized, replaced by a tactical map of legal seafoods. My reflection in the lab window looked back at me, a man of 62, who had spent a lifetime inspecting the structural integrity of bridges. Now I was being asked to evaluate the rot within my own bloodline. Nolan outlined the logistics of the sting with the clinical detachment of an engineer. He explained that undercover officers would be positioned throughout the restaurant, some as waiters, others as patrons in the festive crowd. I was instructed to maintain my persona of a confused and vulnerable elderly man, a role Kezia had already spent months preparing the world to believe. Every word I spoke would be a load-bearing beam in the case against my son and his wife. If you feel a sharp pain, or if they try to force you to drink anything else, use the phrase, "I'm feeling a bit chilly." Nolan instructed, his voice steady. "You're not just a father today, Thane. You're our lead witness. Don't let the father in you blink." The weight of his words was heavier than any lead-based paint. I was a bridge inspector being asked to stand on a structural failure while it collapsed, all for the sake of a perfect report. The smell of the detective's menthol cigarettes clung to his wool coat, sharp and medicinal in the sterile lab. Nolan reached into a black kit and pulled out a series of electronic components. He stood behind me, fitting a state-of-the-art recording device beneath my thermal undershirt. The cold touch of the adhesive tape against my skin felt like a brand, a permanent mark of the transformation from victim to operative. I practiced speaking at a normal volume, the hum of the electronic scanner, confirming that my voice was being captured with terrifying clarity. It was then that Nolan revealed a mid-operation surprise. He wasn't just recording audio. He leaned in and demonstrated how the top buttons on my old wool coat had been replaced with high-definition micro cameras. They were designed to capture every flicker of Kezia's predatory focus, every smirk she thought was hidden by the festive candlelight. How do you wear a wire against a heart that's supposed to be beating for the people you're about to arrest? As I looked in the lab mirror, I didn't recognize the man staring back, a man wired for sound and video, zipping up his jacket to hide the machinery of justice. Is it visible? I asked, my voice sounding hollow. Can you see the bulge under the shirt? It's invisible to them, Thane Nolan replied. But the truth it catches will be undeniable. As I reached into my pocket to grab my keys, my fingers brushed against a small folded scrap of paper that hadn't been there when I arrived. I pulled it out, finding a frantic handwritten warning from Alara's husband. It was just a few words. Something is wrong with Reed Thane. Don't go to the dinner. I zipped up my jacket, the metal teeth of the zipper sounding like a prison door closing on my old life. I'm ready, I said, though my reflection looked like a ghost already in mourning. The drive home was a blur of gray slush and festive lights, the silent house waiting for me like a tomb that hadn't quite been sealed yet. I pulled into the driveway of my Beacon Hill townhouse, the weight of the wire against my ribs, a constant cold reminder of the war I was now fighting. I moved through the historic rooms with the clinical detachment of a man surveying a bridge about to collapse. My first priority was the kitchen. I meticulously cleaned the sink, scouring away any iridescent film or chemical trace of the coffee I'd dumped earlier. I couldn't afford to let Kezia spot a single anomaly when she returned. As I scrubbed, I caught a glimpse of a tiny black dot wedged behind the molding of my study door. I leaned in, my heart skipping a beat. It was a hidden microphone I hadn't planted. They were bugging my own home, listening for the panicked ramblings of a man they hoped was losing his mind. One-shot Thane, I whispered to the empty air, my voice a low rasp. You have to be the man they think you are, just long enough to destroy them. I spent the next hour pacing the floorboards, checking the signal strength of the equipment Prescott had strapped to me. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the foyer sounded like a hammer blow against my resolve, marking the seconds until the curtain rose on this grotesque play. Tick, tock. Every second was a hammer blow against my resolve. The smell of cold ash in the fireplace drifted through the living room, mingling with the scent of dormant dust and the fresh, biting wind whistling against the frost-covered glass. I felt like a stranger in my own life, surrounded by family portraits that now looked like a gallery of people who wanted me in the ground. I retreated to the master bedroom, the one place where I could still feel a shred of the life I'd actually built. I stood before the wedding photo of Savannah and me, her smile a beacon of a time before the rot set in. You warned me, Savannah, I said, the words feeling heavy in the quiet room. I won't let your last act be in vain. I realize now that her intuition was just a different form of engineering, a deep, protective love that spanned the gap between her world and mine. How do you welcome your daughter into a house that's been wired for a war she doesn't know exists? The thought made my stomach twist as the sun began to sink over the Charles River, casting long, bruised purple shadows across the carpet. I checked the micro cameras one last time, ensuring the buttons on my coat were aligned. Then the silence was broken. I heard the distinct grating sound of tires crunching on frozen gravel. I moved to the window, pulling the curtain back just a fraction. Ilara's car had pulled into the driveway, and I saw my grandson Milo's small face pressed against the glass, vibrant and full of an innocence I was about to shatter. But as my eyes drifted to the end of the block, I saw it, a second unidentified vehicle idling in the shadows, its engine running. The loan sharks were monitoring us, a dark sentinel watching the family gather. They're here, I whispered, the gravel crunching beneath their feet as they stepped out into the cold air. It was a violent grating sound that signaled the start of the final act, but it was the shadow of the second car that chilled me to the bone. Milo's laughter pierced the frozen air like a silver bell, a sound of pure innocence that made the cold wire against my skin feel twice as heavy. I stood at the threshold of my Beacon Hill home, the wind rattling the heavy front door frame as I pulled it open. 6-year-old Milo Garrison bounded through the snow, a handmade crayon card clutched in his mitten-covered hand, shouting for his grandfather. Before I could prepare myself, he lunged into my arms, a whirlwind of wet wool and pine needles. I had to pivot sharply, angling my hip, so the boy's exuberant tackle wouldn't land directly on the hard plastic of the recording device or the micro camera buttons hidden beneath my coat. Ilara Garrison, a 32-year-old pediatric oncology nurse, with her mother's warm brown eyes, stepped out of the car, clutching a photo album that held decades of Christmas memories. She walked up the steps with a tentative smile, but as her hand reached out to touch my forehead, I felt the clinical scan of her gaze. "Dad, you look like you haven't slept in a week," she whispered, her voice laced with a worry that had clearly been nurtured elsewhere. "Is everything?" Kezia said. "I mean, are you feeling okay?" It hit me then, a jagged entry twist in our conversation. Kezia had already been whispering in my daughter's ear, trying to convince her that I was a liability who needed a luxury memory care facility as early as next week. Confusion. That was the word they used to bury me while I was still breathing. I forced a grandfatherly chuckle, though it felt like dry gravel in my throat. "I'm just old and stubborn, Ilara. Don't listen to the chatter." I ushered them into the living room, where the scent of the Christmas tree mockingly suggested a warmth the house no longer possessed. Milo was already tugging at my sleeve, insistent on giving me his present early. He handed me the card, the waxy smell of crayons filling the space between us. I stared at the drawing, and the blood in my veins turned to slush. He had drawn stick figures of the three of us, but in the upper corner sat a blue-tinted angel labeled Great Grandma. She wasn't just hovering. She was drawn with a long, spindly arm pointing directly at a dark brown shape that could only be the mink coat in the closet. How could a 6-year-old's crayon drawing carry more truth than the words of my own son? I knelt down, the hidden wire biting into my ribs. "It's beautiful, Milo. But why is Grandma Savannah pointing at the closet?" Milo looked at me with the terrifyingly flat gaze children only use for the absolute truth. "She told me to make sure you saw the angel in the picture, Grandpa. And she said I had to win the game Auntie Kezia gave me." My heart stopped. "What game, Milo?" He leaned in, whispering with a conspiratorial grin that made my skin crawl. "Auntie Kezia gave me a special shiny stone. She told me it was a secret game, and I had to hide it in your big wool coat pocket before we go to the restaurant. If I did it without you seeing, I get an extra dessert." I looked from the crayon angel to the closet door, then back at my grandson, and realized Kezia had already started using the child as a courier for my death. I watched Milo play with the Christmas train set on the living room floor, his small hands guiding the locomotive around the oval track with the kind of focused intensity only children possess. The train was old, its red paint chipped in places, the wheels slightly warped from decades of use. It had been Reed's once a gift from Savannah and me when he was just a boy. The sight of my grandson playing with it should have filled me with warmth, but instead it tore open a wound I didn't know was still bleeding. The living room blurred, and suddenly I wasn't standing in the present anymore. Christmas morning, 1998. The room had been chaos in the best possible way. Wrapping paper scattered like colorful snow ribbon curling across the hardwood. The smell of cinnamon rolls burning in the kitchen because Savannah had gotten distracted by the kids' excitement. Reed was 16, tall and gangly, his voice still cracking when he got excited. He was helping 5-year-old Ilara unwrap a doll, nearly as big as she was, his patience with his little sister infinite and genuine. "Look, Lara. She's got a whole wardrobe. You can change her dress." Ilara had squealed with delight, her chubby hands reaching for the toy. Outside the window, fresh snow had begun to fall, and Reed had jumped up, pressing his face to the glass. Dad, we have to build a snowman before it gets too deep." I had grabbed our old camcorder, the one with the red recording light that blinked like a heartbeat, and followed them into the backyard. Through the tiny screen, I'd filmed Reed and Ilara working together, their breath misting in the cold air. Reed had lifted his sister so she could place the carrot nose, his 16-year-old strength, making her feel like she was flying. Savannah had come up behind me, her hands dusted with flour smelling of vanilla and burnt sugar. She'd rested her chin on my shoulder, her breath warm against my neck, and whispered words that I could still hear with perfect clarity even now, 27 years later. These are the moments that matter, Thane. Not the money or the house or the cars. This, right here. Remember this. I'd turned the camera toward her, catching her smile the way the winter light made her eyes shine. She'd laughed and pushed the lens away, flour fingerprints smudging the glass. Stop it. I look terrible. You look perfect, I'd told her. You always look perfect. I blinked, and the memory shattered like glass. I was back in my living room, tears streaming down my face, my vision blurred. Milo was looking up at me, his small face creased with concern. Grandpa, why are you crying? Are you sad? I wiped my eyes with the back of my hand, my chest tight with a grief that had nothing to do with death and everything to do with the murder of innocence. I'm okay, buddy. I managed my voice rough. I was just remembering when your Uncle Reed played with that same train. Was Uncle Reed nice when he was little? Milo asked, his 6-year-old wisdom cutting straight to the heart of things. He was the best, I whispered. He was the very best. I looked at the train circling its track, an endless loop going nowhere, and I understood with crushing clarity that the boy I'd filmed in that snowy backyard was truly dead. He hadn't died today or yesterday or even a year ago. He'd died slowly by degrees, each compromise and each desperate choice eroding the foundation of who he'd been, until nothing remained but a hollow shell wearing his face. Somewhere between building snowmen and sewing poison into coat linings, I'd lost my son. And I would never get him back. Grandpa, look, Milo's voice pulled me back. I made the train go through the tunnel just like magic. I knelt down beside him, ignoring the protest of my old knees, and wrapped my arm around his small shoulders. That's wonderful, Milo. You're doing great. As I watched him play, I made a silent vow to the ghost of that 16-year-old boy in the snow. I would make sure Milo never knew the kind of desperation that could turn love into murder. I would break the cycle here, even if it meant destroying what was left of my family to do it. The train continued its endless circle, and I held my grandson close, feeling the weight of the wire pressed against my ribs, a reminder that in a few hours, I would stand in a restaurant and watch my son's life derail completely. The clock on the mantel struck 5, a hollow chime that sounded like a funeral bell for the family I used to know. Yet I had to straighten my tie and smile like a man with a future. I stood before the hallway mirror, adjusting my old wool coat over the hidden wire. The cold adhesive of the recording device pulled at the hair on my chest, a constant sharp reminder that I was no longer just a father. I was a living trap. I glanced at the frantic note I had found earlier, supposed to be a warning from Alara's husband. My stomach turned as the truth settled in. It wasn't a warning at all. It was a cryptic confirmation. He had been promised a cut of the insurance money to keep Alara quiet. The rot hadn't just touched my son. It had infected the entire foundation of my family. I watched Alara in the reflection as she helped Milo into his winter gear. The domestic normalcy of her tugging on his boots clashing violently with the electronic pulse against my ribs. I reached up and touched the button camera on my lapel, ensuring it was angled to capture the faces of those I once loved. "You look handsome, Dad," Alara said, stepping up behind me. "That old wool coat always suited you better than the fancy ones Reed likes." I forced a smile that didn't reach my eyes. "It's reliable, Alara. In this world, you have to stick with what won't bite you back." She nodded, unaware that this was the last time my home would ever feel like a home before it became a crime scene annex. Silent night. Holy night. Everything was calm, but nothing was bright. The drive through snowy Boston was a surreal nightmare. As Milo sat in the back seat singing carols, his high-pitched, off-key voice piercing the frozen air. I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. my ears attuned to the faint static hum of the recording device rather than the music. The smell of car exhaust and pine needles filled the cabin, and the heater in the car hummed a low, vibrating note that felt like the countdown of a timer. We passed the Boston Common, where the holiday lights looked like blurred sirens through the frosted windshield, bleeding red and blue into the falling snow. Every time Milo hit a high note, I was reminded of the innocence I was about to shatter to save my own life. Sleep in heavenly peace. Right, Grandpa, he chirped from the back. Yes, Milo. I whispered, my throat tight. Heavenly peace. I glanced in the rearview mirror, checking the shadows behind us. A black van followed at a discreet distance, matching the description of Detective Prescott's mobile unit. But my breath hitched when I saw the second car, the unidentified vehicle from my block, trailing the police van like a shark following a blood trail. They were all moving toward the same point on the map. I killed the engine in front of Legal Seafoods, the vibration of the steering wheel finally ceasing. I sat there for a second, my finger brushing the hidden camera button. A passing waiter carried a polished silver tray, and for a fleeting second, I caught the flash of a badge in its reflection among the crowd. The pieces were in place. I looked at Alara and Milo, then at the restaurant doors, knowing there was no turning back now. The restaurant doors hissed open, venting a cloud of expensive seafood scents and forced holiday cheer into the freezing night as I stepped into the lion's den. I walked through the threshold of Legal Seafoods, the smell of buttery lobster and salt air hitting me like a physical wave. Beside me, Alara and Milo were shivering from the walk, but I was burning with a cold, concentrated heat. I surveyed the lobby with the same vigilance I used to bring to a bridge with suspicious stress fractures. I identified the undercover team almost immediately. A man playing a bored husband slumped in a chair by the window, and a junior host with a military straight spine. As I approached the desk, the junior host handed me a vibrating pager. Reservations for Garrison, please. I said, my voice steady despite the mechanical pulse of the wire against my ribs. Right this way, sir, the host replied, his fingers brushing mine just long enough to ensure I felt the pager's frantic buzz. It was a tactical alert. Kezia and Reed had just entered the building behind us. I handed my old wool coat to the coat check girl, carefully maintaining my distance so she wouldn't feel the hard contours of the recording equipment hidden beneath my thick holiday sweater. The festive decor, the massive tree draped in silver tinsel, and the blue holiday lights felt chillingly artificial, like a stage set for an execution. The restaurant was a symphony of clinking crystal and laughter, but to my ears, it was the sound of a countdown clock ticking toward zero. We were led through the bustling main room to a glass-walled private dining suite that overlooked the dark, icy waters of the harbor. The view was beautiful, but the room itself felt like a cage. I observed the table setting, 25 places, heavy silver, and a large central floral arrangement that provided perfect cover for the micro cameras I was wearing. I pulled out the heavy oak chair at the head of the long table, the sound of it dragging across the wood floor echoing like a gavel. This was the seat of honor, the place where I was supposed to sit and slowly lose my life while my son watched from across the silver. How many of these guests would still be smiling if they knew the main course tonight was a murder confession? Everything looks perfect, doesn't it? Dad, Alara asked, her eyes searching mine for any sign of the confusion Kezia had promised. It is a beautiful view, Alara, I replied, my fingers brushing the cold silver fork at my place. You can see everything clearly from up here. I glanced toward the waitstaff, spotting Detective Prescott's lead tactical officer disguised as the head server. He gave me a microscopic nod, his eyes scanning the perimeter. I sat down and reached for my napkin, but my heart stopped when I saw a small, unauthorized gift bag already sitting on the seat of my chair. Inside was a bottle of artisan water. I held it up to the light, noticing the seal was minutely broken, a jagged plastic edge suggesting Kezia had already made her preliminary move to ensure I was thirsty before the first toast. I sat down and felt the pager in my pocket buzz 3 long pulses. They were here, and the first thing they would see was the man they thought they'd already killed. The double doors of the private suite swung wide, and the air seemed to drop 10 degrees as my son and his wife stepped into the light, their faces prepared for a funeral I wasn't attending. I sat perfectly still at the head of the long table, the white linen spread out before me like a fresh shroud. They hadn't quite managed to wrap me in. When Reed saw me, his entire body jolted as if he'd touched a live wire. The glass-clinking toast he surely had rehearsed died in his throat, and I watched his pale, sweating forehead bead with a sudden greasy moisture. My eyes dropped to his wrist. His smartwatch was visibly flashing a red heart rate alert, a rhythmic blinking that screamed of a terror his mouth couldn't yet articulate. Behind him, Kezia froze, her practiced, mournful expression shattering into a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. Dad Reed finally stammered, his voice a thin, reedy thing. You're already here. We thought you were resting. You looked so unwell this morning." I gave him a slow, measured smile, the kind of smile I used to give to contractors who thought they could hide a structural crack with a bit of plaster. "I'm feeling much better, Reed," I said, my voice projecting clearly for the micro cameras hidden in my lapel. "The air in here is so much cleaner than the townhouse." I watched Kezia's eyes dart to the coat check tag sitting on the tablecloth, and then to the old wool coat I had refused to shed. Panic. It has a smell sour like curdled milk, and it was rolling off my son in waves. He had to shove his hands into his pockets to hide the fact that they were trembling so violently he looked like he was vibrating. Kezia recovered with a speed that was truly terrifying, her face smoothing into a smile that was as sharp and cold as a surgical blade. She approached me, the smell of her floral perfume thick and cloying, masking the underlying scent of the bitter almonds I'd discovered earlier. "Thane, where is the mink?" she asked, her tone carrying a new, demanding frequency. "We specifically chose it for the photos tonight. You know how important memories are at your age. Reed put so much effort into that gift. How does it feel, Kezia, to realize the man you tried to turn into a corpse is the one pulling your strings?" I reached out and touched the cold silver fork at my place, the metal grounding me. "I felt like my old self tonight, Kezia," I replied. "This wool coat is honest. It doesn't hide anything. Don't you think honesty is important in a family?" She didn't answer. Instead, she reached out her fingers, cold and spindly, as they brushed against my neck. She pretended to adjust my collar, a gesture that might have looked like affection to anyone else. But I felt her fingers searching frantically for the hidden pockets she had sewed into the lining. I saw the moment she realized they were empty. Her eyes widened, the pupils shrinking to pinpricks, as she felt the lack of the toxic reservoir she had so carefully prepared. She leaned in close, her breath hot against my ear, and I tasted the salt from the oyster appetizers already sitting on the sideboard. "What did you do with it, Thane?" she whispered, her voice a low, lethal hiss. The silver platter of oysters looked like a collection of cold gray stones, but they were nothing compared to the granite weight of the secrets sitting at my table. As the first course was served, the private dining room at Legal Seafoods filled with the practiced chatter of 25 guests, but my world had narrowed down to two faces. I maintained a facade of grandfatherly cheer, nodding as a neighbor regaled the table with a story about his golf handicap. But my eyes were locked on Kezia and Reed. They leaned together, their heads bowed in urgent, panicked whispers that the micro-camera on my lapel captured with crystalline detail. I watched Kezia's composure slipping. Her perfectly manicured nails dug into the white tablecloth, leaving sharp indentations in the linen. Every few seconds, her eyes darted toward the exit, calculating the distance to the door. Reed looked physically ill, his skin a ghostly shade of gray that made the festive red ribbons on the walls look like fresh wounds. "I told you he wouldn't drink it." Reed hissed, his voice just a tremor in the air. "We need to leave, Kezia. Now." Kezia didn't even look at him. Her jaw was set so tight I thought her teeth might crack. "Sit down, Reed," she whispered back. "If we run now, we're guilty. just let me think. I turned to Ilara, playing up my confusion by asking her for the third time what Milo wanted for his birthday. While I held her attention, I caught a surreptitious movement from the corner of my eye. Kezia's hand moved with the fluid grace of a magician, pulling a small glass vial from her evening bag. She leaned over, pretending to reach for the salt, and I saw the clear liquid vanish into my water glass. The main courses arrived, seared salmon and roasted root vegetables, but the plate in front of me remained a pristine, untouched landscape. I felt the taste of copper in my mouth, the metallic tang of high-stakes adrenaline. Have you ever sat at a table full of laughter and realized you were the only one who could hear the trap snapping shut? I caught the eye of our lead server, who I knew was Prescott's tactical officer. He discreetly checked his watch and gave me a sharp, single nod. The arrest team was in position. The tension at the head of the table had become a physical pressure, a bubble of silence that the other 22 guests were finally starting to notice. "Dad, you're not eating!" Ilara said, her brow furrowing with genuine concern. "Is the salmon too dry?" I looked at her then, at the water glass shimmering with Kezia's third and final plan. I realized then that the bottle of artisan water I'd seen earlier wasn't Kezia's work at all. It was a decoy Prescott had placed there to test her desperation. She had failed the test beautifully. "I'm just waiting for the right moment, sweetheart," I said, my voice projecting with a sudden terrifying clarity. "I want to say a few words first." Ping. The sound of silver against crystal was the first shot fired in the final battle. I gripped the stem of my wine glass, the crystal catching the blue light of the tree, and as I stood up, the room went as silent as a tomb. I looked out at the 25 faces, friends, neighbors, and monsters, and felt the weight of Savannah's wedding ring in my pocket, a cold circle of truth in a room full of lies. I stood at the head of the long table, the wine glass in my hand, appearing steady to the casual observer. But to me it felt like a detonator. Savannah always said that Christmas is a time for revealing what is hidden in our hearts. I began my voice carrying a deceptive, melodic calm. I watched Kezia's eyes. They had shifted from predatory focus to a flickering animal panic, as I deviated from the script of a dying, confused old man. I spoke of loyalty and the foundations we build our lives upon, all while the guests leaned in, expecting a sentimental holiday eulogy. Then I turned my gaze toward my son. My son and his wife gave me a gift so unique. I continued its irony sharp enough to draw blood, that it was designed to last for the rest of my life. "I specifically want to thank you for the morning coffee, Kezia. And that mink coat, Reed. It was a masterpiece of planning." I saw the entry twist take physical form. Kezia's hand flew to her water glass, but she froze. Before the guests arrived, I had switched the place cards. The water she had just meticulously spiked with a third backup toxin was now sitting directly in front of Reed. He reached for it, his throat parched with fierce sweat, but Kezia kicked him under the table, her knuckles turning white as she gripped her silk napkin. Have you ever seen a man realize he has been standing on his own trapdoors? Just as they begin to swing open, Reed's face literally began to crumble. The ghostly shade of gray intensified by the smell of fierce sweat rising from him in waves. My words were a bridge, and I was watching my son and daughter-in-law walk right into the center of the structural failure. I didn't stop. "Reed, you were always so worried about my brain fog," I said, the room starting to ripple with a profound, awkward discomfort. "Do you remember that vintage wine we shared a month ago? The bottle from my own cellar that made me sleep so soundly while signatures were being secured." Reed's fork clattered to the floor, the silver sound echoing like a gunshot. I signaled the undercover waiter, who moved with subtle, predatory grace to block Kezia's path to the exit. Her hand was creeping toward her evening bag, likely reaching for a weapon or the remains of her botanical expertise. "Kezia," I said, my voice dropping to a low, lethal register, "your knowledge of botany is truly breathtaking. I especially admired the timed release mechanism in the fur. A low hum filled the room, a mechanical drone that the guests mistook for the ventilation. "Thane, what are you talking about?" Ilara whispered, her eyes wide with terror. I didn't answer her. Instead, I announced that the festive blue lights decorating our suite were actually forensic-grade UV lamps installed by Detective Prescott's team. Suddenly, the mink coat hanging by the door and the cuffs of my own sweater began to glow with a sickly neon green luminescence. It was the visual signature of the aconite and hemlock, a map of murder written in light. I reached into my blazer and pulled out the crinkling plastic Ziploc bag of greenish-brown death, holding it up until the blue lights made it glow like a radioactive secret. The silence that followed was absolute, a vacuum that sucked the oxygen right out of the room as 25 pairs of eyes locked onto the glowing green evidence in my hand. I stood at the head of the table, my fingers crinkling the plastic of the Ziploc bag, the eerie green glow of the UV lamps reflecting off the faces of my neighbors and my betrayers. I felt the vibrating pulse of the wire against my chest, a rhythmic reminder that every word I spoke was being live-streamed directly to a police server. "This isn't a simple stain, Kezia," I said, my voice cutting through the heavy air. "It's a signature. Aconite and hemlock, the same recipe that followed you from Oklahoma." I raised the bag higher, the visual of Kezia's mascara beginning to smudge as the panic finally breached her defenses. I explained to the stunned room that this wasn't just a gift, but a high-tech delivery system designed to absorb through my skin. "I didn't drink the coffee this morning." I continued, watching her jaw tighten. "I watched it go down the drain, just like your plan." Around the table, the sound of chairs scraping back in fear echoed like a series of small explosions. My old friends pulled away from the antagonists in a wave of physical revulsion, the smell of the ocean air through the glass suddenly feeling like the only clean thing left in the room. A heart attack. That was the script. But tonight I'm the director, and I'm cutting the scene. I turned my gaze toward the rest of the guests, the people who had been my community for decades. "I need to apologize to you all," I said, my voice dripping with cold vindication. "Because for 2 months you have been participating in a play you didn't know was being performed. Every time they told you I was confused, they were just digging my grave a little deeper." I spoke about the gaslighting campaign, the forged notes in my photo album, and the false rumors Kezia had meticulously spread via text and email to prep you for my inevitable decline. They didn't just want me dead. They wanted to erase my credibility so no one would ever question a sudden coronary event. How many of you believed her when she said I was losing my mind? How many of you were helping her kill me without even knowing it? Ilara stood up then, her face white with a mixture of grief and fury. She looked at Reed, then back at me, her hands trembling, as she realized her own brother had been poisoning my reputation to mask a murder. "Did you think I wouldn't notice my own handwriting was a lie, Reed?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper, but carrying to every corner of the suite. Reed looked as if he might physically vanish into his chair, his skin a translucent gray. Before any of them could move, I nodded toward the head server. I announced to the room that the waiter who just served Kezia her wine is actually an MIT forensic technician, and that her glass has already been secured for DNA and toxin matching. I pointed the glowing bag directly at Kezia, the green light casting a ghoulish hue over her perfect makeup, and I saw the first cracks of a monster finally cornered. Kezia tried to stand her chair, screeching like a wounded animal, but I wasn't finished stripping the gold leaf off her lies. I gripped the cold edge of the table, bracing myself as I looked at my son. $4.7 million, Reed, I said, the number cutting through the smell of spilled wine and panic sweat. Was my life really the only currency you had left? Reed's head dropped, his body sagging under the weight of the collective gasps echoing in the high-ceilinged room. I didn't stop there. I turned my focus back to Kezia, whose eyes were darting like trapped flies. I told the room that those loan sharks Reed owes hadn't just appeared out of nowhere. They had been in contact with Kezia for months, She was the one who suggested my execution as the repayment method. Arthur Ward died in Oklahoma the same way I was supposed to. Tonight, I announced, holding the glowing bag of aconite toward her. A heart attack that actually came from a garden. It's your cycle, isn't it, Kezia? Find a widower, pump up the insurance, and let your botany degree do the rest. The elegant Kezia Garrison was vanishing before our eyes, replaced by a serial predator caught in the glare of the truth. Pride. It was the only thing stronger than her greed, and it was the hook that finally pulled the confession out of her throat. Her face distorted, the refined mask cracking to reveal a hideous, prideful rage. "You're 62, she screamed, her voice a jagged blade that sliced through the holiday music. "You've had your time. Why should we all go down just because you're too stubborn to die?" She lunged toward me, her manicured nails clawing at the air. It was perfect. The dosage, the absorption rate. No lab in this city would have caught it if you'd just worn the damn coat. Have you ever seen the human soul leave a person's face? I watched it happen to Kezia, leaving only the predator behind. She wasn't denying it anymore. She was boasting. She ranted about the 6 months of research she'd poured into her chemical cocktail, frustrated only by the fact that her masterpiece had failed to kill me. The guests were frozen in a state of clinical horror, 25 witnesses listening to her absolute admission of guilt. I remained still, my pulse steady against the hidden wire. Kezia reached for her designer clutch, her movements frantic, as she tried to pull something from its silk lining. I knew from the briefing there was a hidden syringe inside, but as her fingers clawed at the bag, she stopped, her eyes wide with a new kind of terror. The waiter, standing behind her, had already performed a sleight of hand, swapping her lethal bag for a harmless prop while she was busy screaming her confession. The power reversal was total. She stood there trembling and empty-handed in a room that had become her cage. She lunged across the table one last time. Her face twisted in a mask of pure rage, screaming one final question. "How did you know? How could you possibly have known?" I looked at her, the clinical detachment of the inspector finally giving way to a profound, weary sadness. I looked Kezia dead in the eye, the silence of the room returning as I prepared to tell her about the ghost she couldn't kill. I looked Kezia dead in the eye, the silence of the room returning as I prepared to tell her about the ghost she couldn't kill. "My wife told me, Kezia," I said, my voice cutting through the heavy air with a supernatural weight. "Savannah saw what you were doing to our son, and she wasn't about to let you take me too. She named the coat. She named the coffee." Kezia's hysterical rage curdled into a stunned, superstitious silence, her analytical mind suddenly confronted by a variable that no ethnobotany degree could explain. Behind her, Kezia attempted to scream that Reed had forced her into the plan, but I simply nodded toward Detective Prescott. I reminded her that the smartwatch on Reed's wrist had been recording audio since the moment I triggered it remotely. The speakers in the room crackled as Prescott played a snippet, Kezia's own voice cold and high-pitched, laughing about my impending heart attack. The entry twist was a final nail in her coffin. Handcuffs, a different kind of jewelry for a Christmas night. The metallic click echoed through the private room as the waiters shed their roles, revealing badges and drawing zip ties. Reed didn't fight. He collapsed into his chair, weeping openly as the 25 guests looked on with a mixture of horror and pity. Nolan Prescott stepped forward, his face a mask of professional grimness, as he began reading the Miranda rights. The family dinner ended not with a toast, but with the cold, legal recitation of the consequences of betrayal. I stood by Alara as they were led out, her hand trembling in mine. My family was a bridge I'd spent my life maintaining, only to find the supports had been eaten away by termites in designer clothes. We followed the officers out toward the lobby, passing the twinkling blue Christmas tree that had just minutes ago acted as the light for their exposure. As we reached the restaurant entrance, Reed stopped. His face was a ruin of tears and snot, his eyes searching mine for a mercy I no longer possessed. "Dad, I'm so sorry," he sobbed. I was scared for Milo and Alara. She said it was the only way to pay them back. The words rang hollow against the backdrop of a 6-month campaign to erase my life. "Don't call me that, Reed," I said, the stinging cold of the waterfront air hitting my face. "Not tonight. Not ever again." He bowed his head, a broken man being led toward the blue and red police lights reflecting on the dirty snow. The smell of salt and diesel exhaust filled my lungs as we watched them reach the vehicles. As Reed was being ushered toward the van, he leaned in and whispered one last thing, a jagged final betrayal. "There is another forged document in the Beacon Hill safe, Dad. One that would have stripped you of your medical power of attorney." I closed my eyes, the weight of the new information, feeling like a structural failure I hadn't yet accounted for. The police van doors slammed shut with a finality that echoed across the frozen harbor, leaving me standing in a world that was suddenly terrifyingly quiet. I looked out at the dark water of the harbor, the festive lights of the city looking like garish scars against the black sky. I was alive, but the house I was returning to was no longer a home. It was just a building of stone and wood, and I was the only one left to keep it from falling down. The restaurant was empty now, the festive blue lights looking like garish scars against the dark windows while I stood alone on the salt-stained curb. The seaport air was a jagged blade of ice smelling of the frozen harbor and the diesel exhaust of the vanishing police cruisers. I watched their red taillights bleed into the Boston traffic, carrying away the wreckage of my family. Alara had already taken Milo home in a separate car, her eyes too full of glass-shattering grief and sudden clinical shock to even look back at the establishment. Detective Nolan Prescott offered me a final somber nod, his boots crunching on the frozen slush as he approached his own vehicle. "It is over, Mr. Garrison," he said, his voice a low rumble against the wind. "Go home. Get some rest." I looked at the dark, moving Charles River, and then back at him. "Rest," I whispered more to myself than to him. "That is a luxury I don't think I can afford anymore." I reached into my glove box to find my registration, and my fingers brushed against a small, forgotten Christmas present from Milo that had slipped behind the manual. It was a keychain with waxy crayon colors that said, "World's Safest Grandpa." The touch of the cold metal reminded me that my survival was for more than just myself. It was for the one part of this family that remained untainted. I sat in the driver's seat, the interior smelling faintly of the pine air freshener and cold vinyl that Savannah always liked. Boston was a postcard of peace, but I was the tremor beneath the bridge, the structural flaw that everyone ignored until the concrete started to scream. I put the car in gear, the engine's vibration, a dull thrumming against my ribs, where the wire had been only an hour ago. I drove through the empty, snow-dusted streets, passing the glowing skeletons of holiday displays in the public garden. They felt like a mockery of my situation, bright and hollow and temporary. Silence. It wasn't the absence of noise. It was the presence of ghosts. I pulled over near the Longfellow Bridge, the tires humming over the bridge joints with a rhythmic thud that sounded like a heartbeat. The Charles River was a black void beneath the ice, swallowing the city's reflection. I looked at the empty passenger seat and finally allowed the clinical inspector's mask to slip. "I did it, Savannah," I said, the taste of salt from dried tears finally hitting the back of my throat. I stopped them. But God, look at what is left. I began to speak to the silence, pouring out the words I couldn't say in front of the cameras or the crowds. "Our boy. He is gone. You knew, didn't you? You knew the supports were failing long before I ever saw the cracks." While I spoke to her, a sudden sharp clarity pierced the fog of my exhaustion. The sixth sense dream wasn't just a warning about the poison or the coffee. It was a way to ensure I survived long enough to find the second safe at the townhouse, the one Reed had mentioned in his panicked final whisper. I put the car back in gear, but as the headlights swept across the frozen river, I saw a single dark figure standing by the railing, watching me with a stillness that made my breath hitch. They didn't move, just stood there as a dark silhouette against the white snow, watching the man who had outlived his own murder. March in Boston doesn't bring spring. It brings a slushy gray accountability that matched the granite walls of the courthouse perfectly. I stood on the steps of the John Adams courthouse, the wind whipping through my overcoat, remembering the dark figure I had seen by the river in January. Detective Prescott had cleared that mystery for me just this morning. It wasn't a phantom or a threat, but a private investigator hired by the insurance company to watch my every move. It seemed the vultures had been circling from every direction, waiting for the first sign of my collapse. I stepped through the heavy oak doors, the sound of them swinging shut behind me, echoing with the finality of a prison gate. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of floor wax and old wood, a clinical scent that offered no comfort. I sat in the gallery of the Suffolk County Superior Court, flanked by Alara and a silent, stoic Jasper Vance. I watched as Kezia and Reed were led in by the bailiffs. They were no longer the curated luxury brand icons from Christmas morning. In their orange prison jumpsuits, they looked like hollowed-out versions of themselves, stripped of the designer armor they had used to mask their rot. The judge took the bench, the fluorescent lights reflecting off the polished wood, in a way that made the room feel even more sterile. The defendant's actions represent a calculated erosion of the most sacred bond family, the judge declared. I listened as the sentence was delivered: 25 years for Kezia and 15 for Reed. Guilty. A 6-letter word that weighs more than a ton of granite. I felt Ilara's hand tighten on my arm, her quiet sobs the only sound in our row. "Does it feel like enough, Jasper?" I whispered, as the gavel hit the sound block with a clinical thud. "Because it doesn't feel like anything to me." Following the criminal proceedings, my lawyer led me into the judge's chambers for the restoration of the living. I sat at a heavy mahogany desk, the rhythmic scratching of a fountain pen across parchment the only sound in the room. I had to sign my name multiple times, proving with every stroke that I was of sound mind, a bitter irony after months of being gaslit into believing I was a man losing his grip. "Your life is your own again," Mr. Garrison, the legal representative, said, handing me the embossed legal paper. On paper, at least. 3 weeks after the sentencing, Ilara arrived at my Beacon Hill door with a lawyer's envelope in her trembling hand. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her jaw tight with a fury I'd never seen in my gentle daughter. The wind howled behind her, but she stood rigid on my doorstep, her knuckles white where they gripped the paper. "Dad," she said, her voice shaking. "Did you know Reed tried to steal from Milo and me too?" She thrust the document at me, a copy of the forged will marked with red legal annotations highlighting the fraud. 80% to Reed, 20% to Ilara. My grandson's future had been reduced to a footnote in his uncle's greed. "Come inside, sweetheart," I said. But she was already pushing past me into the foyer, her movements sharp and jerky. "He didn't just try to kill you," she said, her voice rising. "He tried to rob his own nephew, my son, a 6-year-old child." She spun to face me, tears finally breaking through the dam of rage. "What was Milo going to get, Dad? What was my child going to inherit after you were dead? A fraction scraps." She slammed the document onto the hall table. "While Reed was living off millions, my son, your grandson, would have gotten what enough for college." Maybe I pulled her into my arms as the fury dissolved into sobs. "I know," I whispered into her hair. "I know, sweetheart." When the crying subsided, she pulled back and looked at me with her mother's fierce determination. "But you're alive," she said, her voice steadier now. "That's what matters. We're going to be okay, Dad." "Are we?" I asked, the question escaping before I could stop it. She squeezed my hand. "We will be." The weeks that followed the sentencing were the darkest of my life. The house I'd lived in for 28 years became a mausoleum of memories I could no longer trust. I couldn't sleep without seeing Reed's face in that orange jumpsuit or hearing Kezia's rage. "You're 62. You've had your time." I'd wake at 3:47 a.m., the same time Savannah's warning had come, drenched in sweat, my heart hammering against my ribs. I stopped eating regularly. Food tasted like sawdust. I couldn't look at Christmas decorations without feeling my throat close up. When a neighbor put up Easter lights in April, I had to close all the curtains on that side of the house. Ilara came every day. She'd let herself in with the key I'd given her years ago, brew tea I wouldn't drink, and sit with me in silence. Sometimes she'd bring Milo, and his chatter would fill the dead spaces in the house like light breaking through a crack. "Grandpa, are you sad?" he asked one afternoon, his crayon pausing mid-stroke over a drawing of our family. "Yes, buddy," I admitted. "Very sad." "It's okay to be sad," he said with the wisdom only children possess. "Mommy says sad goes away if you let it." I looked at Ilara. She smiled gently, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "He's right, Dad. It goes away. Eventually." She'd make me walk around the block. She'd open windows to let fresh air into rooms that smelled of stale grief. She never pushed, never demanded I get over it or move on. She just stayed. One night she found me standing in the kitchen at 2 a.m., staring at the sink where I'd dumped the poisoned coffee. "You saved your own life, Dad," she said quietly from the doorway. "Now you have to figure out how to live it." I turned to her, this daughter who'd inherited her mother's strength. "How do I do that? One day at a time," she replied. "And you don't do it alone." The house was legally mine again, but as I stepped across the threshold, the silence didn't feel like peace. It felt like a structural failure of the soul. I wandered through the empty rooms of my Beacon Hill home, the blue light of dusk, hitting the polished floors in long, jagged streaks. I stood by the master closet, staring at the chilling void where the mink coat had once hung. Every court victory had stripped away another layer of the man I used to be. I sat at my desk and pulled out the secret note I had found in the codicil. The entry twist was a final gift from Savannah. She had established a private trust for Milo years ago, a fortress of a fund that neither I nor Reed could ever touch. She had seen the greed coming and ensured the next generation was safe. Her final message to me wasn't about the money, though. "Forgive the blood that spilled," Thane, she had written in her elegant script. "It was never yours to hold." I looked at her photo and whispered, "I won, Savannah. So why does it feel like I'm the one in the cell?" A house is just a bridge over the river of time. If the supports are rotted, it doesn't matter how beautiful the view is. I sipped a cup of cold, stale tea, the bitterness matching the hollow ache in my chest. The letter arrived 2 days later, the rough, prison-issued stationery feeling like sandpaper against my skin. The return address was the correctional facility, written in Reed's familiar, shaky handwriting. I sat by the fireplace, the sound of the wood cracking in the silence, the only companion I had. Reed begged for a visit for money for me to believe that Kezia had forced his hand. "She made me do it, Dad. You have to believe me. You're all I have left." I stared at the ink and saw only the same entitlement that had led to the aconite and the coffee. "You had a father, Reed," I thought, my heart going cold. "You traded him for $4.7 million. Ash." It was the only thing Reed's words were good for now. The boy from the 1998 photo album was truly dead, and holding on to this paper was just holding on to the toxin that had nearly finished me. I reached for my phone and saw a notification from Nolan Prescott. The power reversal was complete. Kezia had already filed for divorce from her cell and was offering to testify against Reed to reduce her own sentence. It was the ultimate betrayal among thieves, a final collapse of the structure they had built. I looked at Reed's letter one last time, then at the fire. I dropped the letter into the embers and watched the lies curl into black smoke, finally understanding that the rescue Savannah intended wasn't for my life, but for my freedom from the people who never truly loved me. The flames licked the paper, turning the desperate pleas into gray flakes that vanished up the chimney. I stood up, the weight of the past finally starting to lift, ready to face a world that was quiet, but finally honest. The buzzer of the first security gate sounded like a gunshot, a violent welcome to the place where my son would spend the next 15 years of his life. I stood at the threshold of MCI Shirley, the sharp smell of industrial floor cleaner and stale sweat hitting me like a physical barrier. I underwent the dehumanizing ritual of the security check, the metal detector's whine, the ink stamps on my wrist, and the rhythmic thud of heavy steel doors closing behind me. I realized with a jolt of cold clarity that even in here, the manipulation hadn't stopped. I had learned that morning that Reed had already filed an appeal using my supposed failing health as a pathetic lever for a compassionate release. He was still trying to use the very lies he'd used to kill me to get himself out of a cell. I was led into the visiting room and took my seat at booth 14, staring through a thick pane of scratched, greasy plexiglass. Reed was led in a few moments later. He wore an ill-fitting orange jumpsuit that seemed to swallow his frame. His posture collapsed like a bridge with a severed suspension cable. His eyes were rimmed with the raw red of a man who hadn't found a second of sleep since the gavel fell in March. "You look like a ghost, Reed," I said, my voice steady as I picked up the heavy black plastic receiver. "I am a ghost, Dad," he rasped, his hand trembling as he mirrored my movement. "I died the night we walked into that restaurant." The silence between us was absolute, broken only by the distant jingling of a guard's keys and the low hum of electronic locks. Reed immediately launched into a technical defense, his words tumbling out in a frantic rush. He blamed the debt, the pressure of the syndicate, and the psychological hold Kezia had over him. He spoke as if he were a bystander in his own life. Forgiveness. It didn't taste like honey. It tasted like ash and cold water. Before I tell you how I finally freed myself from this debt of blood, if you're still watching this unfold with me, comment 5 if you believe a father should always forgive. Or 10 if some sins are final, and give me one reason. Please note what follows contains recreated details for narrative purposes. I stopped his rambling with a simple gesture. "I am not here to punish you further, Reed," I said, feeling the weight of Savannah's secret note in my mind. "The state is doing a fine job of that. I am here to tell you that I forgive you." He stared at me, his mouth hanging open in shock. How, after everything we tried to do, I didn't explain that my forgiveness wasn't a gift for him, but a key for my own shackles. I refused to carry the hatred for him into my final years. I was closing the door on the trauma, ensuring he no longer occupied a single room in my head. How do you tell a man he is forgiven when you are the one who put him behind the glass? As I stood to leave, I performed one final tactical act. I handed a copy of the MIT toxin report to the guard at the desk. It wasn't to help Reed. It was to ensure the prison medical staff knew exactly what botanical expertise Reed could access if he tried to manufacture a medical emergency to support his appeal. I hung up the phone and walked away without looking back. But as I reached the final exit, I felt a phantom hand on my shoulder, a touch that didn't belong to the living. The April air outside the prison was the first thing I'd truly tasted in years, clean and sharp, and smelling of new life, a stark contrast to the stale betrayal I was leaving behind. I stood in the parking lot of MCI Shirley for a long moment, letting the spring wind scour the industrial smell of the visiting room from my clothes. My life in Boston was effectively over, and for the first time I was grateful for the vacancy. I spent the following month overseeing the final clearing of the Beacon Hill townhouse. I watched the movers carry out the last of the heavy, dark mahogany furniture that had defined my life with the Garrison's pieces that now felt like fossils from a buried age. The house was legally mine again, but it was stained with the residue of gaslighting and high-tech toxins. "It is just a house, Ilara," I told my daughter as we stood in the echoing foyer. "We are the ones who make it a home, and we are taking the good parts with us. I don't need 5 floors of history when all I want is a garden that grows for the living." When I finally locked the front door for the last time, I felt the physical weight of the Garrison legacy lift from my shoulders, replaced by a terrifying but welcome lightness. The townhouse was a tomb I'd been tending. The cottage was a seed I was finally brave enough to water. I had chosen a small, sun-drenched cottage in a quiet coastal town, a place where the only surveillance was the rhythmic blinking of a distant lighthouse. While I was moving my tools into the old garden shed on the property, I found the first real miracle. Tucked into a crevice behind the workbench was a small, sealed envelope with my name on it, in Savannah's unmistakable handwriting. I froze, the smell of salt spray and fresh rosemary from the nearby dunes filling the shed. She had purchased this property through a blind trust years before. She ever fell ill, an escape route she'd built for a future she knew I might not survive alone. In my new cottage, I established a simple grounding routine. I spent my mornings tending to a small herb garden filled with rosemary and mint plants that were non-toxic, sweet-smelling, and honest. Sunlight. It was the best disinfectant for a soul rotted by secrets. Milo visited every weekend, and his high-pitched laughter against the sound of the waves became the new soundtrack of my life. We sat on the white-walled porch, drinking cold, sweet lemonade while he showed me his latest drawings. "Look, Grandpa, I drew the garden, and there are no angels today. Just us," he chirped, handing me a sheet of construction paper. "Just us is more than enough, Milo," I replied, feeling the warm sand under my feet. "It is everything." But as I looked closer at the waxy crayon marks, I saw she was still there. Milo had drawn Savannah sitting in the rocking chair beside us, looking healthy and vibrant, her hand resting on my shoulder, just as I had felt it in the prison exit. I sat back in my chair and watched the tide come in the secret envelope from the shed, still heavy in my pocket, promising one last truth from the woman who saved me from the grave. The sea was a flat, shimmering mirror as I finally broke the wax seal on the envelope Savannah had hidden for me a lifetime ago, my heart hammering against my ribs one last time. I sat on the cottage porch, the old crinkled stationery trembling in my hands. As I read her elegant, precise handwriting, the final pieces of the bridge snapped into place. I knew the cracks were forming. Thane, she wrote. "I couldn't fix our son, but I could make sure you were the one who survived the fall." The entry twist left me breathless. Savannah revealed that she had been the one to originally tip off Detective Prescott's mentor years ago, creating the very thread of suspicion that eventually saved my life. She hadn't just appeared in a dream. She had strategically reinforced our family's structural integrity from the beyond by leaving fail-safes in our financial records that only triggered when the ICU debt and the danger reached a critical mass. "You were always the better inspector, Savannah," I whispered to the salt-heavy wind. "You saw the rot before I even smelled it." Her love wasn't a soft, fragile sentiment. It was a tactical shield of steel and concrete that had held the weight of the ultimate betrayal. The ocean doesn't forgive, it just moves on. I decided then that I would be the ocean. I watched the tide begin to turn, pulling the debris of my past out into the deep Atlantic. Christmas morning arrived at the cottage with a brilliance I hadn't seen in years. The rooms flooded with golden sunlight and the smell of real pine and sea salt. There were no heavy weighted boxes this year. Ilara and Milo arrived early, their genuine unforced laughter echoing off the white-walled kitchen. Milo presented me with a new drawing, a simple house by the sea with 3 people inside. The angel grandma was still there, but she was no longer pointing a warning finger. She was just a soft, warm light in the sky, a quiet presence at peace. Is it possible for a house to breathe? Because for the first time in a year, I felt the walls expand with something other than dread. We shared a meal reclaimed from the darkness of the previous year, simple, safe, and filled with the taste of hot, sweet cocoa. "Grandpa, the cocoa doesn't taste like medicine this year," Milo chirped, his eyes bright. "It just tastes like chocolate." "That is because the only ingredient we added today was time, Milo," I replied, savoring the sweetness. "Lots of time." I reached into the back of the envelope and found one last item, a small old photo of Savannah and me, building our first bridge model in the garage. On the back she had written, "The foundations were always solid." I stood on the porch as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the room in gold and lavender. I dropped the letter from Savannah into the small fire pit, watching the paper turn to ash and curl into the winter sky. It left me with a world that was finally beautifully quiet. A bridge isn't just steel and concrete. It's a promise made between 2 points of land that they will never truly be apart. I stood on the porch of my coastal cottage 1 year after that terrible Christmas, watching the Atlantic tide recede over the dark, slick stones as December 2025 drew to a close. The rhythmic sound of the water was the only conversation I needed. For 40 years, I had made my living inspecting the structural integrity of physical structures. But this past year had forced me into the ultimate inspection of my own soul. I realized then that my clinical approach to life, my obsession with hard data and cold rivets, had been the very barrier that kept me from seeing the rot in Reed's character. I had been so busy measuring the world that I had forgotten to feel it. My survival wasn't just a victory over a murder plot. It was a harsh, necessary lesson in empathy. I had to learn that some cracks can't be found with a flashlight and a hammer. Intuition is just the math of the soul. It adds up the things we're too afraid to see. I looked out at the silver path, the moonlight carved across the waves, smelling the salt and the biting cold of the night air. What I had called a haunting or a sixth sense during those dark days in Boston was actually the highest form of engineering ever conceived: a mother's love, spanning the impossible gap between life and death. Savannah hadn't been a ghost. She had been a guardian. I understood now that while the heart can be poisoned and the mind gaslit by those who share your blood, the fundamental truth of one's character is the only anchor that holds when the storm surges. If you hear a voice in the dark, don't ask if it's real. Ask if it's right. I turned my head toward the warm yellow glow of the cottage windows. I could see Alara inside her face, soft in the lamplight, as she helped Milo with a puzzle. They were the new supports for the legacy I was finally building. Correctly, a structure founded on honesty rather than obligation. The taste of the clean, crisp winter air was sweet in my lungs, devoid of the metallic tang of fear that had defined my previous life. I looked down at my own wrist, feeling the steady, rhythmic warmth of my pulse under the skin. It wasn't a phantom touch this time, but the heat of my own blood, vibrant and insistent. "I'm still here, Savannah," I whispered to the wind, my voice carrying a profound, quiet clarity. And for the first time in my life, I know why. I realized she hadn't saved me so I could spend the rest of my days looking back at the wreckage or nursing the wounds of betrayal. She had reinforced my foundation so I could finally see the beauty of the shoreline that was right in front of me. As the final hours of 2025 ticked away, I understood that this year, this terrible, transformative year, had been a gift wrapped in poison. It had stripped away every false comfort, every blind trust, every structural weakness in my soul. What remained was smaller, quieter, but infinitely stronger. I closed my eyes and listened to the waves, finally understanding that Savannah didn't save me so I could look back, but so I could finally see what was right in front of me. The structural integrity of my life was finally restored, not by the absence of pain, but by the presence of a love that refused to fall. I stood there as a man who had outlived his own ending, ready to start a new chapter where the only thing I inspected was the happiness of the people I loved. The year 2025 was ending, but I was finally truly beginning. I used to believe that logic and experience could protect me from anything. I was wrong. This family story taught me that danger doesn't always come from strangers. It can grow quietly inside the people you trust the most. My journey wasn't just survival. It became a form of dad revenge, not driven by hatred, but by truth and justice. If I could speak to the man I was before all of this, I would tell him, don't ignore the small cracks in people you love. Don't let blind trust replace awareness. This family story nearly cost me my life because I chose comfort over confrontation. And this dad revenge only existed because I waited too long to see what was right in front of me. My lesson is simple, but it came at a brutal price. Love should never mean surrendering your judgment. Even faith must walk alongside wisdom. I believe God gave me one final chance, not just to live, but to see clearly. And that clarity showed me that not every bond deserves to be preserved. This family story is my warning, and this dad revenge is my consequence. In the end, I didn't win anything. I just refused to lose myself completely. And if there's one truth I carry forward, it's this: protect your peace before you are forced to defend your life. Thank you for staying with me until the end of this journey. I'd really like to hear your thoughts. What would you do if you found yourself in a situation like this one? Your perspective matters more than you think. If this story resonated with you, consider subscribing so you don't miss what comes next. Just a small note. While inspired by real-life emotional conflicts and social dynamics, certain elements have been dramatized for storytelling. And if this kind of content isn't for you, feel free to explore other stories that better match your interests.